My grandmother made me promise to never contact my twin. The oxygen machine wheezed beside my grandmother's hospital bed as she gripped my wrist with surprising strength for someone dying of lung cancer. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Promise me you'll never look for your twin brother. I stared at her, certain the morphine was making her hallucinate. Grandma Rose, what are you talking about? I don't have a twin. He died when we were babies, remember? Her pale blue eyes, the same ones I saw in the mirror every morning, filled with something I'd never seen before. Guilt. Daniel didn't die. The words came out in a rush, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve. I gave him away. To a family in Oregon. You can never contact him. Promise me. The room started spinning. 25 years of my life suddenly felt like a lie. What do you mean you gave him away? Rose's grip tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. Even dying, she maintained that iron control that had ruled our family's shipping empire for decades. The Whitmore fortune can't be divided. It would destroy everything your grandfather built. Everything I protected. How much money are we talking about? I heard myself ask, though part of me already knew the answer would change everything. 47 million, plus the properties. The companies. She coughed, specks of blood hitting the white hospital blanket. If there were 2 heirs, it would all fall apart in legal battles. I couldn't let that happen. $47 million. My twin brother, Daniel, had been living somewhere in Oregon for 25 years, probably with no idea he was supposed to inherit half of one of Seattle's oldest maritime fortunes. While I'd grown up in the Whitmore mansion on Queen and Hill, attending private schools and summers in the Hamptons, he'd been, what? Working paycheck to paycheck. Struggling to pay rent. Where exactly in Oregon? I demanded. Rose's monitor started beeping faster. Promise me first. Swear on your grandfather's grave that you'll never contact him. I looked at this woman who'd raised me after my parents died in that car crash when I was 3. She'd been everything to me, grandmother, mother figure, mentor. She taught me to play chess on Sunday afternoons, helped me with calculus homework, walked me through my first heartbreak when Jenny Morrison broke up with me junior year. She'd also stolen my brother from me. What's his last name now? I asked quietly. Marcus. Daniel Marcus. The name fell from her lips like a confession. His adoptive parents were good people. Blue collar. They couldn't have children of their own. Daniel Marcus. My identical twin had a completely different life, a different family, probably different dreams and fears and memories. While I'd been learning to sail on Puget Sound, he'd been growing up as someone else's son. The private investigator's report is in my safe, Rose whispered, her voice getting weaker. Behind the Monet in my study. Combination is your grandfather's birthday. She was giving me the exact information she was begging me not to use. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because. She closed her eyes. Because I'm dying, and I can't take this secret with me. But Jack, you have to promise. The family depends on you keeping this quiet. I stared at her, my mind reeling. In the span of 5 minutes, I'd learned I had a twin brother, that I'd inherited a $47 million empire built on a lie, and that the woman I'd loved most in the world was a manipulative monster. I promise, I lied. Rose died 3 hours later, her last words a whispered reminder about the promise I'd already decided to break. I sat in the hospital parking garage until dawn, my hands shaking as I tried to process what she told me. Every memory from my childhood felt contaminated now. All those times she'd get that distant look when I asked about Daniel, claiming it was too painful to talk about my dead twin. The way she quickly changed the subject whenever I mentioned feeling lonely as an only child. The carefully edited photo albums that probably once contained 2 babies instead of 1. By 7 a.m., I was standing in her study at the Queen and Mansion, staring at the Monet that had hung there my entire life. My grandfather's birthday, March 15, 1924. I punched in March 15, 24, and the safe clicked open. The private investigator's file was thick, maybe 50 pages, with a tab labeled Daniel Marcus, ongoing surveillance. My stomach dropped. Ongoing. She hadn't just tracked him down once, she'd been watching him for years. The first page showed a photo that made me dizzy. It was like looking in a mirror, except this version of me had calloused hands and wore a faded Carhartt jacket. Daniel was standing outside what looked like an auto repair shop, wiping his hands on a rag. The timestamp read November 2023, just 3 months ago. I flipped through page after page of surveillance photos and reports. Daniel Marcus, 25, lived in a studio apartment in Portland. He worked as a mechanic at Murphy's Auto Repair, making $18 an hour. No college degree, couldn't afford it. His adoptive parents, Jim and Carol Marcus, had both died in the last 5 years. Jim from a heart attack, Carol from complications with diabetes. The investigator had been thorough. Daniel's credit score, 542. Student loan debt from a technical college program, $23,000. Medical debt from a broken wrist that didn't heal right because he couldn't afford physical therapy, $8,400. His monthly rent for that studio apartment, $1,200, which was apparently more than half his take-home pay. While I'd been worrying about which BMW to buy after college, my identical twin had been choosing between groceries and electricity bills. I found a report dated just 6 weeks ago that made my blood boil. Daniel had applied for a small business loan to open his own repair shop, something he'd apparently been dreaming about for years. The application was denied. Insufficient credit history and no collateral. The loan amount he'd requested? $15,000. $15,000. I'd spent more than that on a watch for my 21st birthday. Rose had spent more than that on flower arrangements for her charity galas. But the detail that broke something inside me was in the personal section. Daniel volunteered at a local animal shelter on weekends, despite barely having enough money to feed himself. The investigator had noted that he'd been doing this for 3 years, never missing a Saturday unless he was working overtime to make rent. My twin brother was a better person than I'd ever been, and he was struggling to survive while I lived in luxury built on his stolen birthright. I kept reading. The most recent report mentioned that Daniel had been having car troubles, his 2004 Honda Civic was dying, and he couldn't afford repairs. He'd been walking 4 miles to work each way for the past 2 weeks. I pulled out my phone and looked up flights to Portland. There was one leaving SeaTac at 2:15 p.m. Rose's voice echoed in my head, "Promise me you'll never contact him." I booked the flight. The flight to Portland felt like the longest 2 hours of my life. I'd thrown some clothes into a bag and left the mansion without telling anyone where I was going. Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret were probably already circling like vultures, preparing for the reading of Rose's will next week. They had no idea their inheritance was about to get a lot more complicated. I landed at PDX with no real plan beyond finding Daniel. The investigator's file had included his work schedule. He was supposed to be at Murphy's Auto Repair until 6 p.m. I caught a taxi, my hands sweating as I clutched the manila folder containing copies of everything I'd found in Rose's safe. Murphy's Auto Repair was exactly the kind of place I'd never set foot in before, a grimy garage in an industrial part of town, surrounded by chain-link fences and buildings that had seen better decades. The smell of motor oil and cigarettes hit me as I walked through the open bay doors. "Help you?" A heavy-set man in coveralls looked me up and down, probably wondering what someone in a $300 button-down was doing in his shop. "I'm looking for Daniel Marcus. Danny's under the Subaru." He pointed to a pair of legs sticking out from beneath a blue station wagon. "Hey Danny, you got a visitor." The legs pushed out, and my breath caught in my throat. It was like watching myself emerge from under that car, except this version of me had grease streaked across his forehead and muscles I'd never developed from actual manual labor. Daniel Marcus sat up, wiping his hands on that same faded Carhartt jacket from the surveillance photos. When he saw me, he went completely still. The wrench in his hand clattered to the concrete floor. "What the hell?" he whispered, staring at me like I was a ghost. Which, I suppose, I was. "Daniel?" My voice cracked. "We need to talk." The other mechanic was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. "Jesus Christ, Danny, you didn't tell me you had a twin brother." "I don't," Daniel said slowly, never taking his eyes off me. At least, I thought I didn't. We ended up at a diner called Pete's, sitting across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth. Daniel had washed the grease off his hands, but I could still smell motor oil and honest work on him. Up close, the differences between us were subtle but noticeable. His hands were scarred and calloused. His face was leaner, probably from years of choosing between meals and bills. There was a wariness in his eyes that I recognized from the mirror, but sharper, like he'd learned not to trust easily. "Start from the beginning," he said, wrapping his hands around a coffee cup that had seen better years. "And don't leave anything out." I told him everything. About Rose's deathbed confession, about the $47 million, about the private investigator files that showed she'd been watching him for years. With each detail, Daniel's face went through a range of emotions, disbelief, anger, something that might have been grief. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Portland drizzle. $47 million, he finally said. "That's what I was worth to her. That's why she threw me away. Daniel. You know what's funny?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I used to have dreams about having a brother. When I was a kid, I'd make up this whole fantasy about a twin who got separated from me somehow. Jim and Carol, my parents, they told me I was their miracle baby. That they'd tried for years to have kids." He looked directly at me then, and I saw 25 years of questions finally getting their answers. "They never knew, did they? About where I really came from?" "I don't think so. The files said Rose paid them through intermediaries. Made it look like a standard adoption." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So they lied to me too?" "No," I said quickly. "Daniel, they didn't know. Look," I pulled out another section of the investigator's file I hadn't shown him yet. "Rose paid a law firm called Henderson and Associates to handle everything. They told your parents you were from a teenage mother who wanted a closed adoption. Jim and Carol thought they were saving you." He took the papers with shaking hands, scanning the legal documents that had orchestrated his entire life. "Jesus. Look at this." He pointed to a dollar amount that made my stomach turn. "She paid them $50,000 to take me. Like I was some kind of merchandise. That's not 50,000, Jack." His voice was getting louder, drawing stares from other customers. "Do you know what $50,000 would have meant to Jim and Carol? They were good people, but they struggled their whole lives. Carol worked double shifts at the cannery just to keep the lights on. And your grandmother was throwing around more money than they'd see in 5 years, just to get rid of me." I watched him process the betrayal, seeing my own anger reflected in his face. But there was something else there too, a pain I couldn't fully understand because I'd never lived it. "There's more," I said quietly, pulling out the financial surveillance reports. "She's been tracking your every move for years, Daniel. Every job, every apartment, every time you applied for credit or loans." He flipped through the pages, his face getting paler. "She knew about the business loan." "What?" "The auto shop I wanted to open. Look at this date," he stabbed his finger at a report from January. "This is 2 days after I submitted my application to Pacific Northwest Credit Union. She knew exactly how much I was asking for, what my business plan was, everything. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You think she had something to do with it being denied?" Daniel was already pulling out his phone, dialing a number. "Marcus here. I need to speak to whoever handled my small business loan application from January. I don't care if it's after hours, patch me through." He waited, drumming his fingers on the table with nervous energy. I could see the mechanic's logic working in his head, putting together pieces of a puzzle that was bigger than either of us had realized. "Mr. Peterson." "Yeah, it's Daniel Marcus. I know this is unusual, but I need to ask you something about my loan denial." "What do you mean, external factors? You never mentioned that before." The conversation went on for 5 minutes, Daniel's face getting darker with each exchange. When he hung up, his hands were clenched into fists. "They had a call," he said. 3 days before they denied my loan. Someone claiming to be conducting a routine financial background check on me. Asked detailed questions about my employment history, my adoptive parents' deaths, whether I had any undisclosed family connections. Rose, I breathed. She tanked my loan, Jack. I've been busting my ass for 3 years, saving every penny, dreaming about opening Marcus Auto, and she made one phone call and destroyed it all. The diner suddenly felt too small, too bright. I thought about Rose in her hospital bed, making me promise to never contact Daniel. She hadn't just been protecting the family fortune, she'd been actively sabotaging him to make sure he'd never be in a position to discover the truth. How many other opportunities did she destroy? Daniel asked, his voice hollow. How many times did I fail at something because she was pulling strings I couldn't even see? I didn't have an answer. But looking at the surveillance file spread across our table, I had a sinking feeling we were only scratching the surface of what Rose had done to keep us apart. Daniel pulled out a battered notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind mechanics use to track repairs. I kept records, he said, flipping through pages covered in his handwriting. Every job rejection, every loan denial, every time something promising fell through at the last minute. He found the page he was looking for and slid it across the table. Look at this pattern. I studied his careful notes. In 2019, he'd been up for a promotion to shop manager at a different garage, the owner had practically promised him the job, then suddenly hired an outside candidate. In 2020, he'd been accepted into a technical certification program that would have qualified him for higher paying positions, but his financial aid was revoked 2 weeks before classes started. In 2021, he'd had a chance to buy his boss's nephew's tools at a fraction of retail cost, but the kid backed out without explanation. Every single one of these would have improved your situation, I said, feeling sick. And every single one fell through right when I was getting close to having real opportunities. Daniel's voice was controlled, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. She didn't just steal my inheritance, Jack. She spent 25 years making sure I'd never climb out of the hole she put me in. My phone buzzed. A text from Uncle Richard, *, Jack, where are you? We need to discuss funeral arrangements and the estate planning. Call me immediately, *. What is it? Daniel asked, seeing my expression. My uncle. Rose's son. The family's gathering for the will reading next week. I looked up at my twin brother. God, it still felt surreal thinking those words. They have no idea you exist. What are you going to tell them? The question hung between us like a loaded gun. I thought about the Whitmore family dynamics, the careful balance of power Rose had maintained for decades. Uncle Richard expected to inherit a significant portion of the estate. Aunt Margaret had already started making plans for renovating the family cabin in the San Juans. My cousin Bradley was probably calculating how much of his Stanford MBA loans he could pay off. I'm going to tell them the truth, I said. Daniel laughed bitterly. And split your inheritance with some stranger from Portland? Come on, Jack. You've lived your whole life as the only heir. Why would you give that up for me? Because it was never mine to begin with. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended. Daniel, that money, half of it should have paid for your college. Should have covered Jim and Carol's medical bills. Should have kept you from choosing between groceries and rent for the last 7 years. But I don't know anything about your world, he said quietly. I've never been to a board meeting or whatever it is rich people do. I fix cars. I live in a studio apartment. I shop at thrift stores. So did I, once. Before Rose taught me how to be wealthy. I leaned forward. But there's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. I pulled out another section of the file, pages I'd almost been too afraid to show him. She didn't just track your finances, Daniel. She tracked everything. Your relationships, your friends, even your dating life. His face went white. What do you mean? There's a whole section on a woman named Sarah Chin. You dated her for 8 months in 2022. Sarah. He breathed her name like it hurt. I was going to propose to her. Had the ring picked out and everything. Then she suddenly said she needed space, that she'd realized we were too different. I slid the relevant page across the table. Rose's investigator approached Sarah at the coffee shop where she worked. Posed as a journalist doing a story on economic inequality in relationships. Asked her pointed questions about dating someone who couldn't afford to take her to nice restaurants, whether she really saw a future with someone who'd probably never own a home. Daniel stared at the surveillance photo of Sarah, a pretty Asian woman with kind eyes, caught in the middle of what must have been that devastating conversation. She destroyed my relationship too. According to this, Sarah spent 3 days crying at work afterward. Her coworker told the investigator that Sarah said it was the hardest decision she'd ever made, but that she couldn't ignore the practical realities. Practical realities that your grandmother planted in her head. I nodded, watching my brother's world reshape itself around this new understanding. Every major disappointment in his adult life had been orchestrated by a woman he'd never met, who decided before he could even walk that he didn't deserve the family he'd been born into. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out the final document. A bank account. Rose has been setting aside money every year since she gave you away. Daniel looked at the statement I handed him. A savings account at First National, under the name D. Marcus Trust, with a current balance of $847,000. What is this? Guilt money, I said. She's been depositing $50,000 every year for the past 17 years. I think she always planned to leave it to you in her will, anonymously, through lawyers, so you'd never know where it came from. Daniel stared at the number, his hands shaking. Nearly $1 million, sitting in an account he'd never known existed, while he'd been rationing meals and walking 4 miles to work. She was going to buy me off, he whispered. Not buy you off, I said, studying the account statement more carefully. Control you. Look at the terms. Daniel squinted at the fine print I was pointing to. What am I looking at? The money comes with conditions. You can only access it if you agree to never pursue any legal claims against the Whitmore estate, never contact any family members, and never publicly discuss your biological origins. I felt sick reading Rose's lawyer's careful language. She was going to give you just enough to improve your life, but not enough to threaten hers. $800,000. Daniel's voice was hollow. That's what she thought my silence was worth. And if you violated any of those conditions, the money would go to charity instead. She had you trapped from birth, Daniel. Either stay poor and unknown, or take her hush money and disappear forever. The diner felt like it was closing in around us. At the next table, a family with 2 young kids was sharing a plate of fries, the parents carefully counting out exact change for their bill. Daniel noticed them too, and I saw him recognize something of himself in their cautious movements. "I need some air," he said abruptly, sliding out of the booth. I followed him outside into the Portland drizzle. Daniel leaned against the diner's brick wall, staring up at the gray sky like he was trying to find answers in the clouds. "You know what the worst part is?" he said finally. "For 25 years, I thought I wasn't good enough. Every rejection, every failure, every time someone chose someone else instead of me, I figured it was because I wasn't smart enough, wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't worth believing in. Daniel. But it wasn't me at all. It was her. This woman I never met has been the puppet master of my entire adult life, making sure I'd never succeed enough to ask questions." He kicked at a piece of broken concrete. "How do you come back from that? How do you trust that anything good that happens to you is real?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. Uncle Richard again. This time I answered. "Jack, where the hell are you?" Richard's voice was sharp with irritation. "Margaret's been trying to reach you all day. We're meeting with the estate lawyers tomorrow morning at 9. Rose's funeral is Thursday, and there are decisions that need to be made." "I'm in Portland," I said, watching Daniel's face carefully. "Taking care of some business." "Portland? What business could you possibly have in Portland at a time like this?" Richard's tone shifted to the condescending voice he'd used when I was 12 and had disappointed him somehow. "Jack, I know Rose's death has been difficult, but the family is counting on you to step up now. You're the primary heir." "Actually, Richard, that's not exactly true." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "What do you mean?" I looked at Daniel, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear. Hope. Resignation. "I mean, Rose left out some important information about my inheritance. Information that affects the whole family." "Jack, you're being cryptic, and I don't have time for games. Just tell me what you're talking about." "I'm talking about Daniel." "Who the hell is Daniel?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough to hear Richard's voice through the phone. I put it on speaker. "Daniel is my twin brother, Richard. The one Rose told everyone died as an infant. Except he didn't die, she gave him away and has been covering it up for 25 years. The phone went completely silent. Not even breathing. "Richard?" I said. "You still there?" When he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. "That's impossible. Jack, I was there when Daniel died. I held Rose while she cried at the funeral." "What funeral?" Daniel spoke up, his voice carrying clearly through the phone speaker. "Who is that?" Richard demanded. "Jack, who is with you?" "That's Daniel, Richard. Your nephew. Rose's other grandson. The one who's legally entitled to half of everything." The phone clattered to the ground as Richard hung up. I stared at the cracked screen, watching raindrops blur the display. "Well," Daniel said dryly, "that went about as well as I expected." My phone immediately started buzzing with texts. "Richard, Aunt Margaret, even my cousin Bradley." Apparently word traveled fast in the Whitmore family network. Asterisk Richard, "This is insane. Get home now, asterisk. Margaret, Jack, please tell me this is some kind of grief-induced breakdown. Asterisk Bradley, dude, what the actual hell? Mom is freaking out, asterisk. They're panicking," I said, scrolling through the messages. "Richard's probably already calling the estate lawyers." Daniel pulled his own phone out, a beat-up Android with a cracked screen protector. "I should probably call my boss, tell him I won't be in tomorrow. Maybe not for a few days." "Why?" "Because once this gets out, my life here is over either way." He scrolled through his contacts. "Hey Murphy, it's Danny. I need to take some emergency time off. Family stuff." "Yeah, I know it's sudden." I watched him navigate the conversation, explaining as little as possible while asking for something he'd probably never asked for before, time off without pay. It hit me that while I was dealing with angry relatives who'd have to share their inheritance, Daniel was risking the job that kept him fed and housed. "Murphy wants to know if I'm in some kind of trouble," Daniel said after hanging up. "Told him I'd explain when I get back." "If I get back?" "What do you mean, if?" Daniel looked at me like I was naive. "Jack, you really think your family's going to welcome me with open arms? The long-lost heir showing up to claim half their fortune? They're going to fight this with everything they've got." My phone rang again. This time it was Margaret. "Jack, honey." Her voice had that fake sweet tone she used when she was trying to manipulate someone. "Richard told me you're having some kind of episode. Why don't you come home and we can talk through whatever's troubling you?" "It's not an episode, Margaret. I found Rose's files. I have documentation going back 25 years. Documentation of what, exactly?" I could hear voices in the background, Richard arguing with someone, probably already on the phone with Henderson and Associates. "Documentation that proves Daniel Marcus is Rose's grandson and my identical twin." "Jack." Margaret's voice hardened. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, you need to think very carefully about your next move. The Whitmore name means something in this city. The foundation, the shipping company, the charitable work, all of it depends on stability. Stability built on a lie. Built on Rose's leadership. She held this family together after your parents died, after your grandfather's stroke, through the recession that nearly destroyed the shipping business. And you want to throw that all away for some stranger?" Daniel was listening to every word, his expression getting darker. I could see him processing how quickly I'd gone from beloved grandson to threat to be managed in my own family's eyes. "He's not a stranger, Margaret. He's my brother. He's someone you met today. Jack, please, just come home. Don't make any decisions while you're emotional." In the background, I heard Richard shout something that sounded like statute of limitations and adoptive abandonment. They're already building their legal strategy, Daniel observed quietly. Margaret must have heard him. Who is that? Jack, you shouldn't be discussing family business with outsiders. Outsiders? Daniel stepped closer to the phone. Lady, I am family business. The line went dead. My phone immediately buzzed with another text from Richard, asterisk family meeting tonight. 8 p.m. Don't bring him, asterisk. I showed the message to Daniel. Looks like they want to circle the wagons. Without me there to defend myself. Daniel's jaw was tight. Convenient. Then we'll both go. Jack. He grabbed my arm. Are you sure about this? Because once we walk into that room together, there's no going back. Your grandmother's secret dies with her, or it destroys everything she built. Those are the only options left. I looked at my twin brother, this person I should have known my entire life, who'd been struggling alone while I lived in luxury, and realized the choice had been made 25 years ago. I was just finally catching up to it. Actually, I said, pulling up my airline app, I think it's time they met you properly. I'm booking us both flights back to Seattle tonight. Daniel stared at me. You want me to crash your family meeting? I want you to attend your family meeting. I found 2 seats on the 7:45 p.m. flight, first class, because suddenly I realized I could afford things Daniel had never even imagined. We'll land at SeaTac by 9:30. Fashionably late, but that might work in our favor. Jack, I can't afford. You're not paying. I handed him the confirmation number I'd just received. Consider it the first installment on 25 years of birthday presents I missed. Daniel looked at the first-class ticket confirmation like it might bite him. I've never flown first class. Hell, I've never flown anywhere. The weight of that statement hit me. While I'd spent college spring breaks in Europe and taken weekend trips to San Francisco just because I was bored, my twin brother had never left the Pacific Northwest. Rose hadn't just stolen his money, she'd stolen his entire world of possibilities. There's something else we need to discuss before we get on that plane, I said, pulling up my banking app. The Whitmore Family Trust has what's called a emergency discretionary fund. Rose gave me access when I turned 21 for quote-unquote unforeseen circumstances. How much are we talking about? 2.3 million. It's supposed to be for family emergencies, legal fees, that kind of thing. I showed him my phone screen. I'm thinking your 25-year kidnapping qualifies as an emergency. Daniel's eyes widened. You can just access that. Right now. Right now. I was already pulling up the transfer screen. What's your account number? Jack, wait. He grabbed my wrist, the same gesture Rose had used in her hospital bed, but this time it felt protective instead of manipulative. If you transfer money to me now, they'll say you're bribing me. That we're conspiring to defraud the estate. He was right, of course. But looking at his cracked phone and worn jacket, knowing he was about to walk into a room full of lawyers and relatives who'd see him as nothing but a threat to their money, I couldn't stand the thought of him feeling powerless. Then we'll do something else, I said. Something they can't argue with. I pulled out my phone and called Henderson and Associates directly. The same law firm that had handled Daniel's adoption was still the Whitmore family's legal counsel. If anyone would have records of Rose's deception, it would be them. Henderson and Associates, this is Patricia. This is Jack Whitmore. I need to speak with whoever handled my family's estate planning. Oh, Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me connect you with Mr. Henderson right away. While I waited for the transfer, Daniel was pacing in small circles, running his hands through his hair. What are you doing? Getting ahead of their narrative, I said. If they want to fight this legally, we might as well start with the lawyers who helped create the mess. Mr. Whitmore. An older man's voice came through the phone, carefully controlled. This is James Henderson. I was very sorry to hear about Rose's passing. Thank you. I'm calling because I've discovered some information about my twin brother Daniel that Rose revealed before she died. The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Mr. Whitmore, Henderson finally said, his voice noticeably tighter, perhaps we should discuss this in person. Are you available to come in tomorrow morning? Actually, Mr. Henderson, I'm standing here with Daniel right now. And I think you should know that we found Rose's private investigator files. All of them. Daniel stopped pacing and stared at me. In the background of the call, I could hear papers shuffling, probably Henderson frantically looking for the Marcus adoption files. I see, Henderson said slowly. In that case, yes, I think a meeting would be very advisable. For everyone involved. The meeting at Henderson and Associates was scheduled for 10 a.m. the next morning. Daniel and I caught the red-eye from Portland, landing at SeaTac at 6:30 a.m. with barely enough time to grab coffee and try to process what we were walking into. I booked Daniel a room at the Fairmont Olympic, partly because I wanted him to experience real luxury for once, but mostly because I knew it would send a message to my family. The Whitmores always stayed at the Olympic. Having Daniel check in under his own name would be like planting a flag. Jesus Christ, Daniel muttered as we walked through the hotel's marble lobby at 7 a.m. This place costs more per night than I make in a week. Get used to it, I said, though I was starting to realize how callous that sounded. This is your world too, Daniel. It always should have been. He stopped walking and grabbed my arm. Jack, I need to tell you something before we go any further. The exhaustion was catching up to both of us, but there was something else in his expression, fear, maybe, or shame. What is it? Last night, after you booked the hotel, I couldn't sleep. So I did some research on your family. On the Whitmore shipping empire. He pulled out his phone, showing me a series of screenshots he'd saved. Your company has been struggling for the past 3 years. I stared at the financial reports he'd found. What do you mean struggling? The shipping industry's been hit hard by fuel costs and labor disputes. According to these reports, Whitmore Maritime lost $12 million last year alone. Daniel scrolled through more screenshots. There are rumors they might have to sell the cargo fleet. My stomach dropped. Rose never mentioned any of this. Because she was protecting you from it, just like she protected you from me. Daniel's voice was grim. Jack, I don't think your family's angry about splitting the inheritance because they're greedy. I think they're terrified because there might not be much inheritance left to split. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Whitmore Maritime was failing, then the 47 million Rose had mentioned might be mostly theoretical, tied up in company assets that were hemorrhaging money. My family wasn't just facing the shock of a long-lost heir, they were facing financial ruin. That changes everything, I said. It gets worse. Daniel showed me another article, this one from the Seattle Business Journal dated just 2 weeks ago. They're facing a major lawsuit from the Teamsters Union. Something about pension obligations that weren't properly funded. The potential damages are estimated at 15 million. I sank into one of the hotel's plush lobby chairs, my mind racing. So when Richard and Margaret heard about you yesterday, they weren't just thinking about losing half their inheritance. They were thinking about losing everything, and then having to split what's left with some stranger who might demand immediate cash payouts they can't afford. Daniel sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Jack, I've been thinking about this all night. Maybe we should reconsider the whole thing. What do you mean? I mean maybe Rose was right. Maybe the family fortune can't survive being divided, especially now when the company's already in trouble. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I realized I did too when I was stressed. Maybe I should just walk away. Absolutely not. But if claiming my inheritance destroys the company, then we both end up with nothing. Plus, all the people who work for Whitmore Maritime lose their jobs. How is that justice? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Richard. Henderson moved the meeting to 8:30 a.m. Don't be late, asterisk. They moved up the meeting, I told Daniel. We need to go. As we grabbed a taxi to the law offices, I couldn't stop thinking about what Daniel had discovered. The Whitmore family's panic suddenly made more sense, and their legal strategy probably did too. If they could prove that splitting the inheritance would bankrupt the family business, they might be able to argue that Rose's deception had actually been a fiduciary necessity. There's something else, Daniel said as our taxi pulled up to the glass tower that housed Henderson and Associates. I called that credit union this morning. The one that denied my business loan. And they still have the recording of that routine background check call. The woman who called claimed to be from something called Whitmore Financial Services. My blood turned to ice. Rose didn't just interfere with your loan. She used the family company to do it. Which means there's probably a paper trail. Phone records, maybe even expense reports. Daniel's eyes were hard. Jack, your grandmother didn't just steal my inheritance and sabotage my life. She used company resources to do it. If the business is already struggling financially, and it comes out that Rose was spending company money on private investigators and financial manipulation, the shareholders would have grounds for their own lawsuit, I finished. Exactly. We're not just talking about family drama anymore. This could be corporate fraud. As we walked into the marble lobby of Henderson and Associates, I realized that Daniel and I weren't just about to confront our family's lies. We were potentially about to uncover crimes that could destroy everything the Whitmores had built over 3 generations. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending to our own execution. But when I looked at Daniel's reflection in the polished steel doors, I saw something I hadn't expected, determination. My twin brother might have been raised in poverty, but he'd learned something I'd never had to, how to fight for what was right, even when the odds were impossible. Ready? I asked as the elevator doors opened. Daniel straightened his shoulders, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like he belonged in this world of marble and mahogany and million-dollar legal battles. Let's go get our inheritance, he said. The conference room at Henderson and Associates felt like a courtroom, with Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret seated on one side of the mahogany table like prosecutors preparing for trial. James Henderson, a silver-haired man in his 70s, sat at the head with 3 thick files spread before him. When Daniel and I walked in together, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jesus Christ, Richard whispered, staring at Daniel like he was seeing a ghost. It really is true. Margaret's perfectly composed facade cracked for just a moment before she regained control. Mr. Henderson, surely there are legal precedents for this kind of situation. Abandonment laws, statute of limitations on inheritance claims. Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, the situation is more complicated than that. He gestured for Daniel and me to sit. I've spent the night reviewing the Marcus adoption files, and I'm afraid there are some irregularities that need to be addressed. Irregularities? Richard's voice was sharp. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest your mother may have committed several felonies over the past 25 years. Henderson opened one of the files, revealing documents I hadn't seen before. Daniel, I need to ask you directly, were you ever told that you had biological family looking for you? Daniel's jaw tightened. No. Jim and Carol told me my birth mother was a teenager who wanted a closed adoption. They said she specifically requested no contact. That's because we told them that's what Rose wanted, Henderson said quietly. But according to Washington state law, adopted children have the right to access their birth records when they turn 18. Daniel, did you ever try to search for your biological family? Of course I did. In 2016, right after I turned 18. Daniel pulled out his phone, scrolling to what looked like saved emails. I contacted the state adoption registry. They told me my birth records were sealed by court order and couldn't be released without biological family consent. Henderson's face went gray. Mr. Marcus, there was never a court order sealing your records. Someone at the state office was misinformed about your case status. The room went completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Margaret broke first. James, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Rose didn't just arrange Daniel's adoption. She's been actively interfering with the legal system for 25 years to prevent him from discovering his origins. Henderson turned to another section of documents. In 2016, when Daniel contacted the adoption registry, Rose's office manager, Patricia Henley, called the state office claiming to be his birth mother and requesting that his records remain sealed for another 10 years. That's identity fraud, Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. Among other things, yes. Henderson looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. It gets worse. In 2018, when you applied for that technical certification program, someone called the financial aid office claiming to be conducting a background check for a potential employer. They suggested you might not complete the program due to family instability issues. I watched Daniel's hands clench into fists. How many times, Mr. Henderson? How many times did she interfere with my life? Henderson flipped through page after page of phone records and expense reports. Based on these records, at least 17 separate incidents over the past 7 years. The business loan was just the most recent. 17 times, Richard repeated numbly. She sabotaged him 17 times. And billed it all to Whitmore Maritime as security consulting fees, Henderson continued. Which means, technically, Daniel's own inheritance money was being used to keep him from claiming his inheritance. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. This is insane. James, you're talking about our mother like she was some kind of criminal mastermind. Mrs. Whitmore, I helped Rose arrange Daniel's adoption because she told me it was temporary. That she needed time to restructure the family trust to accommodate 2 heirs instead of 1. Henderson's voice was heavy with what sounded like decades of guilt. She promised me it would only be for a few months, just until she could work out the legal complexities. But it wasn't temporary, I said. No. Every year, I'd ask Rose about bringing Daniel home, and every year she'd find another reason to delay. The company was expanding, there was family drama with your parents' estate, the market was unstable. Henderson looked directly at Daniel. By the time I realized she never intended to bring you back, you were 15 years old with a life and family in Oregon. I convinced myself it would be more traumatic to disrupt that than to leave things as they were. You convinced yourself, Daniel repeated, his voice ice cold. While I was working 2 jobs in high school to help Jim and Carol pay for Carol's insulin. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances, and I could see them both doing the math, realizing that while they'd been complaining about Rose being too controlling with the family money, Daniel had been watching his adoptive mother ration medication they could have afforded with pocket change. There's one more thing, Henderson said reluctantly. Rose's will contains a provision I helped her draft last year. She left specific instructions that if Daniel's existence ever came to light, he was to receive exactly $1 million, contingent on signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and waiving all future claims to the Whitmore estate. $1 million, Daniel said flatly. Out of $47 million. Plus the requirement that you never contact any family members or discuss your biological origins publicly. Henderson slid a thick legal document across the table. She also included a clause stating that if you refuse these terms, the entire estate would be donated to the Seattle Maritime Foundation, leaving nothing for anyone. I stared at the document, feeling like I was looking at Rose's final act of control. Even in death, she was trying to manipulate both Daniel and me, forcing us to choose between family and money, knowing that either choice would destroy something precious. So those are our options. I asked. Daniel takes the hush money and disappears, or everyone gets nothing. Unless we can prove Rose's will was written under fraudulent pretenses, Henderson said carefully. Which, given what we now know about her decades of illegal interference in Daniel's life, might actually be possible. Richard leaned forward, his face pale. James, if we challenge Rose's will in court, how long would that take? 2 to 3 years, minimum. And during that time, the entire estate would be frozen. Henderson's meaning was clear. Whitmore Maritime couldn't survive 3 years without access to family funds, especially with the company already struggling. Daniel stood up suddenly, pushing back from the table. I need some air. As he walked toward the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, I realized that Rose's final manipulation was working perfectly. She'd created a scenario where Daniel's very existence threatened to destroy the family he'd never been allowed to know, making him the villain in a story where he'd always been the victim. The silence in the conference room stretched until Daniel finally spoke from his position by the windows, his voice barely audible. There's something I haven't told any of you yet. He turned around, and I could see tears in his eyes, the first time I'd seen my brother cry since I'd found him under that Subaru yesterday. Carol, my adoptive mom, she died 3 years ago from diabetic complications. But it wasn't just diabetes. His voice cracked. She'd been rationing her insulin for months because they couldn't afford her prescriptions and the mortgage payments after Jim's heart attack. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Henderson looked like he might be sick. The last thing she said to me in the hospital was that she was sorry she couldn't leave me anything. That she and Jim had failed me because they couldn't even afford to keep their house. Daniel's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. She died thinking she was a failure as a mother because she couldn't give me the opportunities she thought I deserved. Richard stood up slowly, his face ashen. Daniel, You want to know what the real kicker is? Daniel cut him off. I found the receipts in Carol's purse after she died. She'd been buying the cheapest generic insulin she could find, the kind that doesn't work as well, and stretching each vial by reducing her doses. She literally killed herself trying to save money for my future. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Margaret crying quietly. So when Mr. Henderson sits there and tells me that Rose left me $1 million in hush money, that's not justice. That's not even charity. That's Rose throwing pocket change at a problem she created, while my real mother died trying to give me opportunities that should have been mine by birthright. I felt something break inside my chest. While I'd been complaining about Rose being overprotective, Daniel's adoptive mother had been literally dying to try to provide for him. Henderson cleared his throat. Daniel, there's something else in Rose's files that you should know about. Something I discovered this morning. He pulled out another document, this one with the letterhead of Swedish Medical Center. In 2020, when Carol was first hospitalized for diabetic complications, someone called the hospital's financial aid office. They claimed to be conducting an insurance verification and suggested that the Marcus family might have undisclosed assets that would disqualify them from charity care programs. What? Daniel spun around. Carol and Jim were initially approved for significant medical bill forgiveness through the hospital's low-income assistance program. But after that phone call, they were required to undergo additional financial scrutiny. The approval was delayed by 6 months, during which time the bills accumulated interest and penalties. Daniel's face went from pale to red. You're telling me Rose interfered with Carol's medical care? The phone call came from a number registered to Whitmore Maritime's corporate account. The caller identified herself as Patricia Henley, Rose's office manager. I watched my brother process this information, and for a moment I was genuinely afraid he might physically attack someone. The rage in his eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen. She killed Carol, he said quietly. Rose killed my mother. Daniel, Richard started. No. Daniel slammed his fist on the conference table, making everyone jump. Don't you dare try to minimize this. Rose didn't just steal money from me, she actively sabotaged the medical care of the woman who raised me. Carol died because she couldn't afford insulin, and she couldn't afford insulin because Rose made sure the hospital wouldn't help us. Margaret was openly sobbing now. Oh God, Daniel, we didn't know. We never knew any of this. But you should have. Daniel's voice echoed off the conference room windows. You should have asked questions. You should have wondered why Rose was so secretive, why she got that weird look whenever anyone mentioned my name, why there were never any pictures of me as a baby in the family albums. He was right, and we all knew it. The signs had been there for 25 years, but we'd all chosen comfort over curiosity. So here's what's going to happen, Daniel continued, his voice steady now despite the tears. I don't want Rose's blood money, and I sure as hell don't want her non-disclosure agreement. What I want is justice for Carol Marcus, the woman who died trying to give me the opportunities that Rose stole from me. Henderson leaned forward nervously. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we burn it all down. Daniel's declaration hung in the air like a bomb with the pin pulled. Henderson actually reached for his water glass with shaking hands, while Richard looked like he might pass out. What exactly do you mean by, burn it all down? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. I mean we expose everything, Daniel said, pulling out his phone. Every illegal phone call, every fraudulent interference, every time Rose used company resources to sabotage my life. We take it public, we take it to the FBI, and we let the chips fall where they may. Daniel, wait, I said, standing up. If we do that, we destroy Whitmore Maritime completely. The federal investigation alone would. Good. His eyes were cold. Maybe the company deserves to be destroyed. Maybe something built on 25 years of fraud and identity theft shouldn't exist. Henderson was frantically flipping through his files. Mr. Marcus, I understand your anger, but you need to consider the collateral damage. Whitmore Maritime employs over 300 people. The charitable foundation supports dozens of Seattle nonprofits. The scholarship program has sent nearly 100 kids to college over the past decade. Kids like me, who never got the chance. Daniel's voice was sharp. How many of those scholarship recipients got their opportunities because Rose made sure I couldn't have mine? Richard cleared his throat, his face gray. Daniel, there's something else you need to know about the company's current situation. Something that might affect your decision. He pulled out his own folder, one I hadn't seen before. Whitmore Maritime isn't just struggling financially. We're 3 weeks away from defaulting on a major loan with Pacific Northwest Bank. If we can't make the payment, they'll seize the cargo fleet. How much? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. 8.2 million, due February 15th. Richard's voice was hollow. We've been negotiating with the bank, trying to restructure the debt, but they want proof of stable collateral before they'll extend the terms. Daniel laughed bitterly. Let me guess, you were counting on the inheritance to cover it. The inheritance, plus liquidating some of the family properties, Margaret admitted. The Hamptons house, maybe the San Juan cabin. We thought we had options. But if Daniel goes public with Rose's crimes, the scandal alone would make the bank call in the loan immediately, Henderson added. No financial institution wants to be associated with fraud allegations. I sat back down heavily, the full scope of our situation finally becoming clear. Daniel wasn't just threatening to expose family secrets, he was threatening to trigger a cascade of financial destruction that would ripple through Seattle's maritime industry. There's more, Richard continued reluctantly. The Teamsters lawsuit I mentioned. Their lawyers have been sniffing around Rose's business practices for months. If they get wind of systematic fraud involving company resources, they'll argue that all of our union negotiations were conducted in bad faith. What does that mean practically? Daniel asked. It means they could demand immediate payment of all pension obligations going back 15 years, Henderson explained. We're talking about potential damages of $30 to $40 million. The room fell silent as everyone processed the numbers. Even if the inheritance was worth the full $47 million Rose had mentioned, it wouldn't be enough to cover the company's obligations if Daniel's revelations triggered a full investigation. So you're saying I have to choose, Daniel said slowly. Take the hush money and let Rose's crimes go unpunished, or expose the truth and destroy 300 jobs in the process. There might be a third option, I said, an idea forming. What if we don't go public, but we also don't let Rose's will stand as written? Henderson looked up sharply. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we rewrite the rules entirely. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the emergency fund I'd shown Daniel yesterday. The family trust has multiple discretionary accounts that Rose never touched. Money that's completely separate from the company's operating funds. How much total? Daniel asked. Across all accounts. Nearly 12 million. I looked directly at my brother. What if we use that money to cover the immediate company debts, keep Whitmore Maritime afloat, and then restructure everything else as equal partners? Margaret was shaking her head. Jack, even if that's legally possible, 12 million isn't enough to solve all our problems. But it's enough to buy us time, I said. Time to sell assets properly instead of in a fire sale. Time to negotiate with creditors. Time to rebuild the company on an honest foundation. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at Elliott Bay. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. There's something else we haven't discussed yet. Something that might change everyone's calculations. He turned back to face the room, and I saw something new in his expression, not just rage or grief, but strategic thinking. I've spent 7 years learning how to fix things that are broken, he said. And from everything you've told me about Whitmore Maritime's problems, most of them aren't actually about money. They're about inefficiency. Daniel pulled out a battered notebook, the same one he'd used to track his sabotaged opportunities, and flipped to a section filled with detailed sketches and calculations. Yesterday, while you were booking flights, I couldn't sleep. So I spent 4 hours researching Whitmore Maritime's operational reports from the past 3 years. He spread several hand-drawn diagrams across the conference table. Your fuel costs are 30% higher than industry average because your routing software hasn't been updated since 2018. Your labor disputes keep happening because you're using the same contract templates from the 1990s. And your cargo capacity utilization is running at 62% when it should be over 80. Henderson stared at Daniel's sketches like they were written in a foreign language. I'm not sure I follow. He's saying we're bleeding money because we're incompetent, Richard said flatly, studying one of Daniel's diagrams. Is that right, Daniel? I'm saying you're bleeding money because Rose ran everything like it was still 1985, Daniel corrected. Look at this, your maintenance schedules are based on calendar time instead of actual engine hours. You're replacing parts that have thousands of miles left in them and running others until they fail catastrophically. Margaret leaned forward. How could you possibly know that? Daniel's smile was grim. Because I've been fixing the results of your maintenance screw-ups for 3 years. Murphy's Auto Repair has a contract with Seattle Port Authority. Half the trucks that come into our shop are Whitmore Maritime vehicles that broke down because someone changed the oil on schedule instead of when the engine actually needed it. The room went dead silent. Richard's face was turning red. Our trucks have been serviced at Murphy's, he asked slowly. Your trucks, your supervisor's personal vehicles, even some of the port equipment Whitmore Maritime is contracted to maintain. Daniel flipped to another page in his notebook. I've personally worked on 17 different Whitmore vehicles over the past 2 years. Every single one came in with problems that could have been prevented with proper predictive maintenance. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Daniel, are you saying? I'm saying I've been unknowingly fixing the mechanical problems caused by my own family's poor management, while living paycheck to paycheck because that same family stole my inheritance. His laugh was bitter. Murphy always wondered why I got so angry working on the Whitmore fleet jobs. Now I know why. Henderson was frantically taking notes. Do you have documentation of these maintenance issues? Daniel pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like hundreds of photos. Every repair comes with before and after photos for insurance purposes. I've got pictures of transmission failures, brake system neglect, engine problems, all from vehicles that should have been caught in routine maintenance. Jesus Christ, Richard muttered, looking at Daniel's phone screen. That's our 2019 Peterbilt. We just had that truck serviced 2 months ago. Serviced wrong, Daniel corrected. Look at this brake wear pattern. Someone's been using the wrong grade of brake pads for your load weights. This truck was an accident waiting to happen. Margaret was pale. How many accidents have we had in the past year? For minor ones, 2 major insurance claims, Richard admitted reluctantly. Our insurance premiums went up 40% last renewal. Because you keep having preventable mechanical failures, Daniel said. Insurance companies aren't stupid, Richard. They know the difference between bad luck and bad management. I stared at my twin brother, realizing I was seeing him in his element for the first time. The quiet mechanic from yesterday had transformed into someone who understood complex systems in ways that none of us did. What would it cost to fix? I asked. All of it. The maintenance protocols, the routing software, the operational inefficiencies. Daniel was quiet for a moment, scribbling calculations in his notebook. Hardware and software upgrades, maybe 200,000. Staff retraining, another 100,000. But the real cost would be admitting that Rose's way of doing business was fundamentally broken. And the potential savings? Conservatively. 4 to 5 million per year in reduced fuel costs, maintenance expenses, and insurance premiums. Daniel looked up from his calculations. Aggressively. Maybe 8 million annually if you're willing to completely modernize the fleet management systems. The numbers hung in the air like a lifeline. Henderson was the first to break the silence. So theoretically, he said slowly, if Daniel were to take an active role in Whitmore Maritime's operations, the company might actually become profitable again. More than profitable, Daniel said. But it would mean gutting every system Rose put in place and starting over with modern practices. Richard and Margaret exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe. Or hope. Daniel, Richard said carefully, would you be willing to postpone any legal action while we explore this option? My brother's expression hardened. That depends. Are we talking about postponement, or are we talking about justice for Carol? The room went dead quiet at Daniel's mention of Carol. I could see Richard and Margaret both struggling with how to respond to that. How do you negotiate justice for someone you never knew existed until yesterday? Henderson cleared his throat nervously. Daniel, from a legal standpoint, there might be grounds for a wrongful death civil suit against Rose's estate. The medical care interference, the financial sabotage that prevented Carol from affording proper treatment. Against Rose's estate. Daniel's voice was sharp. Mr. Henderson, Rose is dead. Suing her estate means suing the same inheritance that should have been mine all along. That's not justice, that's just moving money from one pocket to another. I watched my brother pace to the windows again, his reflection ghost-like against the Seattle skyline. When he turned back, there was something different in his expression, not anger anymore, but cold calculation. Here's what justice looks like, Daniel said, pulling out his phone. Carol Marcus Memorial Foundation. We establish it with $10 million from the Whitmore estate, not as hush money, but as acknowledgement of the harm Rose caused. The foundation provides medical bill assistance for working families who can't afford prescription medications. Margaret's eyes widened. 10 million. Daniel, that's more than. More than what? More than I'm worth. Daniel's smile was razor-thin. Mrs. Whitmore, your mother spent 25 years actively sabotaging my life. She used company resources to commit identity fraud, medical interference, and financial manipulation. 10 million isn't compensation, it's a bargain. Richard was frantically calculating on his phone. Even if we agree to that, we still have the 8.2 million loan payment due in 3 weeks, plus the Teamsters liability, plus operational losses. Which brings us back to the company modernization, I interrupted, seeing where Daniel was heading. If his projections are right, and we can save 8 million annually through better management, the foundation payment becomes affordable within 2 years. Henderson was taking notes rapidly. So we're talking about a comprehensive restructuring. Daniel joins the company as, what? Chief Operating Officer. Vice President of Fleet Management. Co-owner, Daniel said flatly. Equal partner with Jack. 50-50 split of everything, just like it should have been from the beginning. The silence stretched until Richard finally spoke. And in exchange? In exchange, I don't take Rose's crimes to the FBI. The family reputation stays intact, the company gets the operational overhaul it desperately needs, and Carol's memory gets honored properly. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Plus, I finally get to know the family I was stolen from. I felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. For the first time since we'd sat down, this felt like a negotiation instead of a hostage situation. But then Margaret's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and went pale. It's Bradley. He's at the house with, she answered quickly. Bradley, slow down. What do you mean, reporters? We could all hear the panic in my cousin's voice through the speaker, though the words were muffled. Margaret's face got progressively whiter as she listened. How many? She asked. Since when? A pause. Oh God. Okay, don't say anything to anyone. We're coming. She hung up and looked around the table with undisguised terror. Someone leaked Daniel's existence to the Seattle Times. There are 3 news vans outside the Queen and House, and they're asking questions about financial irregularities in the Whitmore family trust. Daniel and I stared at each other. Neither of us had contacted any reporters. Who else knew about this? I asked Henderson. Just us, and his face went gray. Patricia Henley. Rose's office manager. She would have had access to all the adoption files, all the investigator reports. Richard was already pulling up the Seattle Times website on his phone. Here it is. Whitmore Maritime heir emerges after 25 years, questions surround family shipping fortune. As he read the article aloud, my stomach dropped further with each sentence. Someone had given the reporter everything, Daniel's name, his location in Portland, even details about the failed business loan and Carol's medical bills. This isn't just a leak, Daniel said, studying Richard's phone screen. This is a coordinated attack. Look at these quotes, someone spent hours briefing this journalist. The article included a statement from a source close to the family, suggesting that Daniel's claims were a potential fraud scheme targeting Seattle's maritime industry during a vulnerable period. Margaret's phone rang again. This time it was the main number for Whitmore Maritime. The office, she said grimly before answering. Hello, Jean. What do you mean, how should we respond? Respond to what? Her face crumpled. How many calls? I see. No, don't transfer any of them. We'll be there within the hour. She hung up and looked at us with something approaching panic. 43 phone calls since 8 a.m. Reporters, competitors, 3 different law firms, and Pacific Northwest Bank asking for immediate clarification of our current ownership structure. Henderson stood up abruptly. We need to accelerate this timeline considerably. If the bank thinks there's ownership uncertainty, they could call in that loan today instead of waiting 3 weeks. Can they do that legally? I asked. The loan agreement includes a clause about material changes in corporate structure, Richard said miserably. If they determine that Daniel's existence constitutes such a change. Daniel was staring at Richard's phone, reading the article more carefully. There's something else. Look at this paragraph about Whitmore Maritime's recent financial struggles. This reporter has access to information that should be confidential. He was right. The article mentioned specific details about the Teamsters lawsuit, the insurance premium increases, even the fuel cost overruns Daniel had identified. Someone's been planning this for a while, I said, a horrible realization dawning. Someone wanted Daniel's existence to come out, but in the worst possible way. Henderson was gathering his files with shaking hands. We need to assume that everything we've discussed this morning will be public knowledge by tomorrow. Which means we have approximately 24 hours to either reach an agreement or watch everything collapse in real time. Daniel looked out at Elliott Bay one more time, then turned back to face us with grim determination. Then we'd better get to work. The next 6 hours were a blur of legal documents, phone calls, and damage control. By 3 p.m., we'd assembled an emergency board meeting in Henderson's conference room, Richard, Margaret, Bradley, myself, and Daniel, with Henderson serving as mediator. The Seattle Times article had triggered exactly the avalanche we'd feared. Pacific Northwest Bank had moved up their loan review to Monday morning, the Teamsters lawyers were demanding immediate disclosure of all family trust documents, and our insurance company was threatening to suspend coverage pending investigation of ownership irregularities. But something unexpected had happened too. 3 competing maritime companies had called, not to gloat over our troubles, but to make acquisition offers. Apparently, Whitmore Maritime's fleet and port contracts were more valuable than we'd realized, if someone could fix the operational problems Daniel had identified. So we have leverage, Daniel said, studying the acquisition offers. The question is whether we use it. Bradley, who'd been mostly quiet during the legal discussions, finally spoke up. I've been running numbers all afternoon. If we sell to Pacific Maritime Holdings, they're offering enough to cover all our debts plus $20 million in cash to the family. And put 300 people out of work when they consolidate operations, Daniel replied sharply. Plus destroy 3 generations of Whitmore family legacy. What legacy? Margaret asked bitterly. Rose built everything on a lie, Daniel. Maybe it deserves to die with her. I watched my twin brother consider this, saw him weighing justice against pragmatism in a way I'd never had to. Everything I'd inherited had come easily, everything he might gain would cost something precious to someone else. There's a 4th option, Daniel said finally, pulling out his notebook one more time. What if we don't sell to our competitors? What if we sell to our employees? Henderson looked up sharply. An employee buyout. A worker cooperative. The drivers, mechanics, dock supervisors, they know the business better than any outside buyer. Daniel was sketching again, but this time his diagrams showed organizational charts instead of engine repairs. We sell them the company at a discount, use the proceeds to cover our immediate debts, and keep the family properties separate. Richard was shaking his head. Daniel, maritime workers don't have $20 million to buy a shipping company. No, but the Teamsters Pension Fund has $2 billion looking for stable investments, Daniel replied. What if instead of fighting the union lawsuit, we partner with them? They provide the capital for employee ownership, we provide the fleet and contracts, everyone wins. I stared at my brother, realizing he'd been thinking 3 moves ahead while the rest of us were still trying to understand the game. The employees keep their jobs, the union gets a profitable investment, and we solve our legal problems by making them partners instead of adversaries. Exactly. And here's the beautiful part, Daniel's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since I'd met him. Carol always said the best way to fix something broken was to give it to the people who actually have to make it work every day. Henderson was frantically taking notes. The legal structure would be complex, but it's absolutely possible. We'd need union approval, employee votes, financial restructuring. How long? I asked. 6 months minimum. But if we can get preliminary agreements signed this week, the bank and other creditors might be willing to extend deadlines. Daniel looked around the table at faces that had gone from hostile to hopeful over the course of one afternoon. So here's my final offer. We established the Carol Marcus Memorial Foundation with $5 million, not 10, because the employee buyout reduces our available cash. We restructure Whitmore Maritime as a worker cooperative with Jack and me retaining 20% ownership each to honor the family legacy. And we do it all publicly, with full disclosure about Rose's crimes, so everyone knows we're choosing transparency over cover-ups. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. What about Rose's reputation? The family name? Aunt Margaret, I said gently, Rose made her choices 25 years ago. We can't protect her reputation without perpetuating her crimes. Richard nodded slowly. The Whitmore name will survive. It might even be stronger if we're known as the family that chose to do the right thing when it mattered. By 8 p.m., we had the framework of an agreement. By midnight, Henderson had drafted preliminary documents. And by sunrise on what would have been Rose's funeral day, the Seattle Times was running a very different story. Whitmore family announces revolutionary worker ownership plan, maritime company to become employee cooperative. The funeral itself was surreal. Daniel stood beside me at Rose's graveside, both of us wearing matching black suits that highlighted just how identical we really were. The crowd of mourners kept doing double takes, whispered conversations rippling through the gathering as people processed the reality of Rose's deception. But the moment I'll remember forever came during the reception, when Patricia Henley, Rose's office manager and the source of the original leak, approached Daniel with tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I knew it was wrong, but she was so convincing. She made it sound like protecting the family business was more important than... Than what? Daniel asked quietly. More important than my life. More important than Carol's life. Patricia nodded miserably. I leaked your story because I couldn't live with the secret anymore. But I also couldn't let Rose take it to her grave without consequences. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then surprised everyone by reaching out and squeezing her shoulder gently. You did the right thing, Miss Henley. 25 years too late, but still the right thing. 6 months later, Whitmore Maritime officially became a worker-owned cooperative, with Daniel as chief operating officer and me as president of external relations. The employee owners voted to keep the Whitmore name, but added a new company motto, built by the people who make it work. The Carol Marcus Memorial Foundation funded its first medical bill assistance grants in December, helping 12 families avoid the choice between medication and mortgage payments. Daniel insisted the first recipient be a woman with diabetes who reminded him of Carol. And on our 26th birthday, the first we'd ever celebrated together, Daniel and I stood on the deck of the Whitmore Pioneer, the flagship of our worker-owned fleet, watching Seattle's lights reflect on Elliott Bay. You know what's funny? Daniel said, leaning against the railing. I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't good enough for opportunities that never came. Turns out I was being prepared for an opportunity one never could have imagined. What's that? He smiled, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before, genuine contentment. The chance to build something better than what Rose tore down. The chance to make sure no other kid grows up thinking they're not worth fighting for. That night, I finally understood what Rose had really stolen from us. It wasn't just money or time or even each other. She'd stolen our chance to choose who we wanted to be together, as brothers, as partners, as the men we might have become if we'd grown up knowing we were never alone. But she hadn't stolen our chance to choose who we'd become next. And we chose to be better than her legacy. We chose to be worthy of Carol Marcus's love, Jim Marcus's pride, and each other's trust. We chose to be the Whitmore brothers, together, finally, and forever.